After my cancer diagnosis, I started looking deeper at what stress really does to the body, and what I found shocked me. And it might change the way you think about your health. It's another week, another discovery. Let's dive in. Today, we are going to talk about stress, what it really is, and what it does to your body. So, as I stated a second ago, it's a critical factor in your health, and it is not just about feeling bad or, having a hard time. So, let's jump in. Why stress matters for health. So, ultimately, modern life is very stressful. We find ways to be stressed out, and we're just always stressed. Managing stress often is not our top priority, whether it's work or just general life events. There's always a reason to be stressed. It's not always emotional, though, right? So it's not just you're worried about something going bad, the war in Ukraine or something like that. Sometimes it's physical, right? And it has the ability to majorly reshape your body and your life, in all honesty. So, what is stress? Well, there's a couple different ways we can look at stress. There is a transactional model, which is basically fight or flight. Stress. You've got demands, and you've got the amount of resources that you have in your body, which is a very kind of generic way to look at it. So you have a problem that is presented to you, and the first thing you do is you assess, what tools do I have to resolve this problem? And if you feel like you have the tools to resolve the problem, you might view that as a challenge, as an opportunity to learn and grow. But if you do not have the tools, then you start to feel stressed. Like, I can't do it, but I still have to. And so that's the kind of a generic way of finding out or representing stress. Then there's also the GAS, General Adaptation Syndrome, which is kind of more of the actual biological actions that happen in your body. And there's studies that have gone into this. They're too detailed. I'm not gonna read them out directly, but basically, this model is kind of your fight or flight impact, right? Something happens and your body goes into freak out mode, and you basically have cortisol released and a bunch of other different things that happen in your body. But it causes your body to shift its energy reserves to action. And so the purpose here is, you're in the woods and you see a bear, you have the option to run for your life. Or you see a kid being crushed by a car, all of a sudden you're 2 times stronger than normal, you can lift the car, right? That's the kind of intention of stress in our historical context to be able to survive, is the ability to, in the moment of intense danger, probably would be the main reason, you have the tools to act. Well, one of the things that happens is your body gets a ton of glucose available to it, and you get your liver and your muscles are all told, stop doing what you normally would do. Make sure you have the energy for what you need. And that's super valuable in the case of a super instant stressful situation. But in the case of chronic stress that just continues and doesn't end, you had a 5-minute interaction with a lion and you needed to be able to run for your life, but instead it is something that is happening periodically every day. That is chronic stress and is the main thing I want to talk about today. While regular stress is very interesting as well, chronic stress is what is going to affect your health the most, because your body in a stressful situation can react and then re-regulate, and it did what it needed to do and there's no problems. But when you're constantly stressed, obviously the impacts aren't quite as intense as you saw a lion and you're running for your life, but it does affect the body. So let's talk about how it affects the body. So we talked about, basically when stress activates, cortisol floods your system, it spikes your sugar and gives you energy, which is what you want. And the other things that happens is your heart rate increases, which causes your blood pressure to go up and your fat breakdown to soar. This all gives you energy for what you need, but it is not necessarily something that you want happening all the time, because you don't need your blood sugar high and your blood pressure high. These are actually bad things if they're happening all the time. So let's talk about chronic risk and stress, specifically in the cancer realm. So the link between chronic stress and cancer as a causer isn't incredibly well isn't proven, we'll say. So having chronic stress is definitely not a good thing, but in the studies that I looked at, generally having stress didn't cause you to have cancer. So there's a slight linkage, but it's not incredibly strong. However, it does weaken the immune system and promotes tumor growth in the case of you already having cancer. So let's talk a little bit about cancer progression along with stress. So basically what happens when you are stressed, specifically chronic stress, the stress hormone suppresses the p53 tumor suppressor pathways, and it enhances the ability to create new blood vessels to the tumor. So what that means is that your tumor is naturally being suppressed by the body, but when you're under chronic stress, you don't have the ability to fight the tumor, and it allows you to grow blood vessels to the tumor. All of these lead to the tumor growing faster and potentially lead to metastasis. So what they found is in the case of cancer, when you have chronic stress, it actually makes everything much worse, which is tough because when you have cancer, the first thing that you're going to be is stressed out. And in the case of my own self, while interestingly enough, I feel like the cancer itself hasn't been the biggest stressor for me, with my son, that was my stress moment, we'll say, that I think caused my cancer to progress significantly. I'm pretty sure, based off just the way I feel, there was some interactions with my bowel movements that were a certain way before and after my surgery, that I believe I probably had the actual cancer for 3 to 5 years before last year. But I didn't have significant symptoms. Now, obviously, it was growing slowly, things like that. But when I was at St. Jude, all of a sudden, I started, bleeding and things like that. And it clearly accelerated during that time. And it was weird, too, because when I came back home, I actually kind of got better. Not actually got better, but the symptoms went down. And the key indicator, the key thing that was happening was just the general stress going on. So if you have cancer, managing your stress risk is incredibly important in your fight against cancer, because it ultimately is helping the cancer progress when you want it to go the other way around. Okay, so that's cancer. It's scary, and it's part of the reason why I'm having this video is I think stress is very important as you fight cancer, but it's also important for other major diseases. So let's talk a little bit about chronic stress and type 2 diabetes. So with diabetes, the link between cancer or between diabetes and stress is actually higher. It's a lot more likely to cause diabetes if you're constantly chronically stressed. What happens when you have that, constant glucose spike from the stress because you're prepping to fight for your life? Now, this is a little bit of my own assessment, is you start to get insulin resistant. And what that does ultimately lead to is to type 2 diabetes. So what they have proven is, if you're constantly stressed, the chances of you having diabetes goes up. And it is not always a causal factor, but when you have diabetes and stress together, it can progress and get worse. So managing your stress in your fight against diabetes or to lower your risk of diabetes is an important action to take. Now, lastly, the number one killer of everyone is heart disease. And the linkage between chronic stress and heart disease is super tight. In fact, they have indicated it is almost as bad or maybe as bad as smoking. So really, what happens with stress is, we already talked about it, it can cause your heart rate to go up, it can increase your blood pressure, but it also introduces all that glucose, and part of what happens there is it can increase the plaque buildup in your arteries, which ultimately leads to clogged arteries, and then you end up with a heart attack. So stress is an incredibly powerful, I don't know if I want to call it disease, but it's like thing that happens to us that can have real impacts to our health, especially in the case of chronic, constant stress. So let's compare them a little bit. So if we look at cancer risk, right, it definitely is impacted by cancer, but it's really depends on what's going on, right? There's different studies, there's different things. In some scenarios, it found it as 8% increase, other cases 110%. But ultimately, what matters more is once you have cancer. And while the linkage hasn't been proven, I think there's a chance that, before you have cancer, you just don't have it, so stress doesn't directly impact it. But once it starts, it can move it to the next stage. And they have found that. And the thing is, you never really know when you have cancer at the beginning, right? When you got, stage 0, stage 1, you don't know it, and your stress could drive it up. Diabetes and heart disease, there's a much higher correlation to stress and the progression of those diseases. And realistically, if you are struggling with either of those, stress should be part of your overall strategy. Stress management, could be part of the strategy to fight those diseases. So, why managing stress could save your life? Well, we kind of just talked about it. It's disease prevention. Like, we are trying to avoid getting the diseases that will kill us. And techniques, exercise, therapies, mindfulness, social support, all these things can play a part into stress management. And, a big part of it too is controlling your mind, because your mind has the ability to make you sick. It's kind of insane the more I read about stress and like the power of the mind to cause problems in your body. All right, so that's it for today. Next week, I'm going to talk about what causes stress, and then week after that, we'll talk about ways to fight stress. So we're not going to leave you with just what it is, but wanted to take a little bit of a dive in what stress is and how it can impact your body. It is kind of scary, and it's something we want to get control of. So, as always, do your own research. I have a couple sources listed in my description here if you're interested, as where I got some of the information for my own research. But yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for joining me. Drop me a comment or a like. I'd love to know what you think. Have a wonderful week.